So, hello, good morning, and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you're watching us from, whichever part of the world. Uh, Today is the second part of the series, Resisting Anti-Gender Agenda, and we on purpose use the word agenda. But this time I will start a bit in a more different tone. Only this year, or in the past year, 350 transgender people were killed. 1 in 4 of those murdered were aged between 19 and 25. The majority of the murders were committed in Latin America, Brazil specifically, which has the highest number of murder cases. There is a rise in Africa, more than double, which also, I would say, doesn't surprise with the new homosexuality laws that were brought. There's also a rise in the United States. Many hate crimes and murders have in mind go unreported, which means that the actual number of deaths is far higher than this one. Behind these numbers are people whose lives we failed to protect. Meanwhile, democracies across the world shift to right-wing parties, bring along anti-gender and LGBTIQ plus policies with increasing criminalization and persecution. This is additionally fueled by online and offline hate speech, especially prevalent among political actors and religious and other conservative public figures. Transgender Europe, or actually their annual Trans Murder Monitoring Project report, is released annually every year to mark Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is actually being marked on 20th November, which is today, depending on which part of the world you are. Transgender Day of Remembrance is a day when we remember those transgender, diverse, and non-binary people who have been victims of homicide and whom we have lost. Also, we also remember all our friends and other queer people in war-torn zones. So I just wanted to start with that. And for us who are still here and living, we have lived one election year that was one of the biggest, let's say, election years. And there was the so-called the biggest democracy election also in the United States. And that election is also over. People have voted, and now we all have to live with it. Even though this event series is focused on reproductive justice and LGBTIQ plus rights, these talks have to be political. It's inevitably that we talk about politics because sexuality, gender diversity, and sometimes just simply the existence of queer people is a common enemy for conservative, nationalist, and fascist agendas in parties worldwide. And easily, gender and sexuality become a battleground for political gains. And we have seen this in many political campaigns in this year, which is further strengthening anti-human rights narratives, thus legitimizing the violence against queer communities and normalizing nationalist discourse. So today we continue our conversation, focusing on LGBTIQ plus human rights in this current realm, where democracy stands today, what it means to citizens, who benefits, who loses, what are the changes we may see, and actually what can we learn from trans and queer history, while at the same time preserving our dignity and freedom and self-determination. And since we will go back a bit to history, who can talk better on these issues than historians themselves? So today we virtually go to United States, to San Francisco, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Susan Stryker. Hi, Susan. So Susan has immense biography, and I always learn always something new when I look, and Susan is very humble. But I will just say a few things that I think are important for our audience, and of course, please do look in the chat, write, and our communication people will be sharing links. So Susan is an award-winning author, an activist, an expert in transgender history and queer theory, leading transgender studies scholar and historian. What I found specifically interesting is that Susan became a founding member of the group Transgender Nation, which is a digital transgender archive. And Susan was also the executive director of the GLBT Historical Society, raising 2 million, if I found information well. And this is important because we will talk about funds and philanthropy with Nino as well. The movie, actually the documentary, Screaming Queens, The Riot at Compton's Cafeteria, is Emmy award-winning documentary. Among other things, Susan was professor at Gender and Women's Studies at University of Arizona, where Susan served as the director of the Institute for LGBT Studies and founded the university's Transgender Studies Initiative, which we will talk about if it exists and not. Also visiting Yale University professor and many others. But what's also another important thing to say is that Susan is the author of Transgender History. It's so there is a book and there is co-editing of 2-volume Transgender Studies, Reader and Reader Ranks. So this is just a small or short overview, and I will come back to some of these points when it comes especially to your documentary award-winning movie, and also when we talk about funds and who do we ally with. So welcome, Susan, and thank you for being with us because it's very early in San Francisco.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. This is exactly the kind of work that needs to happen. So I'm very pleased to show up and do my part. Thank you for the invitation. It's always good to connect with you.
It's my pleasure, and I had the privilege, if I can say it, to meet Susan privately and to spend some time, and that's when I actually, learning is also by being with somebody, not only by reading, but also listening to personal stories, and Susan is phenomenal in storytelling, and basically Susan's work is about storytelling. But I will go back now to the current situation where we're at. So as we said, the election year is almost over. All main elections are done. Trump has won. I don't know what we were hoping for, but I mean, with the popular vote, it was really
not that.
Yeah, it was really crazy. I found a very nice quote, and I also have another quote of you, but now I will quote Bertolt Brecht that said, and the quote is taken out when he was speaking of Germany because he was criticizing Nazism a lot. Brecht said, "The good were defeated not because they were good, but because they were weak." And my question is, can this quote be applied to today's situation in USA? Or if I rephrase it, why the Democrats lose? Why the left, liberal, progressive, why are they so weak? Why they're so fractioned? How come they failed to bring all the oppressive groups, which is not necessarily only queer people, but also Black people, brown people, and other minorities? How did they fail to bring those groups together? What would be your stand on that? Because as you said, nobody was expecting this big win.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you for it. And taking a very long view, I think in the 1960s and early 1970s, there were very powerful social movements in the United States. I mean, not just in the US, but around the world. That many different minority communities were mobilized. It's like that's where we see the beginnings of Black Power movements and Brown Power movements and Native American and Indigenous movements, feminist, queer, trans movements. Are all very robust, I would say. From the mid 60s to the mid 70s. And they were crushed. That's what I would say. It's like that they were, movement leaders were assassinated. Um, Movements were infiltrated by the government. Dissension was sown. And that there was a kind of retreat. I mean, I don't think that the United States has had an effective left movement in my lifetime. I mean, there's conservatives, there's centrist liberals, and then there's a scattering of small leftist groups and organizations. Um, and why did the Democrats not rally people in this election? It's like I think Brecht was right. It's like they were weak, and they were weak because I think the Democratic Party, from around 1973 or so, certainly by the time you get to Bill Clinton in the early 90s, the Democratic Party became the party of neoliberal capitalism. It was a party that paid, I would say, lip service to inclusion and diversity, uh, but that it was not the party that was the party of the working people. There was not a class consciousness there. It very much became the party of, people I would call the sort of the technocratic elite who had a certain competency in, running social institutions and government. But it's like it did not have a truly popular base. Maybe that's an exaggeration to say that. But what we've seen is that primarily on economic issues, people feel like the Democratic Party has been very out of touch with their needs. Uh, and, in this most recent, well, both with Hillary Clinton, and with Kamala Harris, while there was certainly racism and sexism involved in opposition to them, I think there was also a real perception of they're just saying the focus group tested most banal things you could say to sort of not offend people. Like they came across as inauthentic and not really caring and slick. And that for all of Trump's just sheer, yeah, bullshit, and conspiracy mongering and emotional and cognitive dysregulation. I think people felt like he was going to do something, or like they kind of knew where he was coming from. And I think that was, um, I mean, I'm just devastated by what happened. Um, but I think the left, such as it is, Democratic Party, really failed to take people's genuine sense of precarity to heart, and that they seem to be hypocritical and disingenuous. The issue that I think more than anything else helped divide the left, such as it is in this election, was the differences of opinion over Israel and Palestine and the U.S. role in supporting Israel. Uh, I think Harris lost support in the state of Michigan, which has the highest proportion of Arab and Muslim voters. She lost a lot of young people. She lost the left wing of the Democratic Party, and I personally have very strong views on what's happening in Palestine. It's like it does seem to me to um, meet the definitions, internationally recognized definitions of genocide, and for the so-called left in the U.S. to not even be able to like say straight up, yes, this is a problem and we're looking into it, and it's like to just completely disregard that. I think it alienated a significant fraction of potential voters. I think there were something like 20 million, 15 or 20 million fewer votes for Harris than for Biden. You know, there were so many people who just felt like they had uh, nothing that they could affirmatively vote for, so they just didn't vote, and that contributed to Trump's win.
Thank you. We will come back to certain of these points, and especially how you mentioned 60s and 70s. And as you said, people are disappointed. I also read recently somewhere, people never vote for nothing. They always vote for something. So I don't know if it's, choosing between a lesser evil. And I know you are, I personally know, and my colleagues know you're a person of integrity. And this is, what gives you also a value and the voice, just like Judith Butler and Masha Guess and many other queer scholars. And this is interesting how the queer movement also stood up for certain injustices. But this is related to US. I will now switch a bit to Georgia and to another part of the world and what's happening there. And before we go to Georgia, I want to introduce you to our second panelist, Nino Ugrelice. Did I say it right? I'm so very sorry. Yeah, I did not. I assume. I'm sorry.
No worries, really. No worries. It's long and difficult. Just
thank you, and I apologize. But I also had the opportunity to meet Nino just recently. So Susan, I know for 10 years or so. But this is just a coincidence. It's not like I'm bringing my friends. I just want people to be aware of that. And it also tells how our circles are small, and this also adds value to our conversation. But just in short, Nino is a feminist justice advocate from Tbilisi, Georgia. And Nino knows people. So Nino is all around the world, has worked with AVID, Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, Tasso Foundation, and currently serves as a regional advisor to the Urgent Action Fund. Nino is also co-founder of the Dalan Fund in Georgia. And with 15 years of experience, so young, and already knows all the big heads and where to look for money and philanthropy, and also very vocal on certain issues. So Nino, welcome, and thank you also for being the Georgian voice, or if I may say, the voice of this world here. I will have to go, so as we said, we go political again, and we discussed about it, and you just recently came back from a trip in Sofia in Bulgaria, but we shall not only talk about Georgia, even though Georgia was just recently, and I'm sorry I didn't mention her name, because her name was also one of the names on the list of DGEU trans murder monitoring report, a trans woman from Tbilisi who was murdered in her apartment 2 days after the legislation on LGBTIQ has passed, but we will come back to that. My question to you would be also in this context of positioning Georgia, just like we positioned USA. It's interesting that Russia, I don't know if many people know that, and Susan was also in Russia. Russia had many back and forths when it comes to homosexuality in general, when it comes to laws. So there was this freedom period, and then there comes the Stalin era, and why am I mentioning that era? Because in that time, which was similar in Yugoslavia at the time, homosexuality was criminalized and framed as a threat to Soviet state, to the ideology, to the moral values of that society. And it was usually being linked, being homosexual, to upper class decadence, and it was followed, of course, by oppression, imprisonment, and many other things. And do we see, would you say, is this kind of regression now happening in Georgia, but not only Georgia, because you were very vocal about Russia and about surrounding countries, especially because Georgia is, I feel, somehow now pressed between East and West, very orthodox, strict Russia, as like with all the proxies, and then with East, and then with the West, now that Biden has lost and Trump is there, because US was still sort of a haven as somebody who could criticize the government in Georgia, and now we will lose this too. So how these Russian anti-gender narratives shape these local attitudes towards LGBTIQ plus community, towards people, and in general, how does this regional politics affect Georgia? Because Georgia was very visible in its struggles. It was all over the TVs, the protests, how did it all happen? And could you give us just a brief intro, not only Georgia, but maybe surrounding and the influence of Russia?
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for having me sharing this space with children, especially. It's like a huge honor. I really cannot believe this is happening to me. So I'm like, yay. I wish we didn't have to have conversations like this at all, but that's not the life we're living. Not that we will anytime soon. What I wanted to start from is that I really appreciated being grounded in today and the data you shared from TGU. And to add some layers there, this year in 2024, there's a trans monitor that TGU is having. 46% of trans people that were killed in Europe, Caucasus, in Central Eastern Europe, Caucasus, and Central Asia are sex workers. So that specifically also needs to be named, and this is a very important dynamic we really have to sit with while we are talking about today. Georgia. This is a very difficult and very long conversation, and definitely one of the biggest threads and ties that is a departing point is Russian Federation and the laws that are generated there since 2012, when Russia started first the foreign agents law, then the law on banning gay propaganda, and the gay whenever you hear gay propaganda, you should know that's a Russian product. Just recently, last week, they were also talking, and they adopted the new law in Russian Federation that is banning child-free propaganda. So if people would, this especially women, if they would, or anyone who can have children, would decide that they don't want to have children and will openly talk about it, that's illegal. So I always refer to Russian Federation as a projection and scenarios of how life will look like in our parts of the world, because unfortunately our governments are really closely aligned. I always say that Georgian government is a fast learner. They really, really followed the playbook. We call it authoritarian playbook for a reason, right? So Georgian government really is following that playbook. They really put the finger on the text, and they're like point by point, bullet point by bullet point, doing what Russian product is telling us to do. Namely, first they proposed this foreign agents law, which first was introduced in last year. It was March last year. There was a massive pushback, and they pulled it, the government pulled it back, but then it came back this year. And in everyone's surprise, because I feel like movements and people in Georgia were in very active denial that it wouldn't happen, the law passed. And within months' time, the Georgian government also added a layer and a cherry on top of anti-gay propaganda law as well. That law will be active in 2 weeks' time. So basically, killing trans people and, well, people is illegal, but talking about the fact that killing trans people is bad is gonna be illegal in 2 weeks. So that's the reality we have to live just in a couple of weeks. This law, this anti-gay propaganda law, basically is touching everything from education to healthcare. For example, I studied gender for my master's, and like the program has to shut down. Anything that mentions anything gender and feminist related has to be removed from curriculums. Needless to say, anything about sexual and reproductive health and rights or sex education. For example, in the realms of healthcare, HIV key populations will not have access to key services, so on and so on. The list is very long. So the speed on which we are observing basically the human rights and dignity for all being gone in Georgia is insane. We have to talk a lot about Georgia, and thank you so much for creating space for that, but we also have to zoom out, because what's happening in my country right now is a, first of all, regional dynamic, but it's also very global. I can only talk about my region right now, but certainly there are ties, as you mentioned, Naida, in Africa, and the laws that were adopted there, and the evangelical church that is, by the way, funded by Russia. So ties here are very deep. Some of the countries that are having similar laws are Kyrgyzstan. In April, Kyrgyzstan adopted foreign agents law. In May, Georgia followed. Kazakhstan is trying to adopt the anti-gay propaganda law as well. Then we have Belarus, who also is trying to adopt the law, as if the life there is not difficult enough, as if they need this on the paper. Russia, of course, is the place. There was attempts in Slovakia, the Hungary. By the way, Orban is right as we speak. There's a case I think it's in Strasbourg right now, the case against Orban, because the law is against European Union. At least there's some mechanism to push back there. So it's happening today as we speak, the hearing itself. Orban, by the way, is one of the biggest funders of anti-rights organizing. The money he is pouring into, actually not only in Europe, but globally, we're talking about millions here. So, and then Bulgaria, they just a month and a half ago adopted the law against gay propaganda as well. So different parts of Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia are under the same, we are all in the same boat pretty much, which is where, while we are having very similar struggle, I always feel like this is where our strength is as well. We're going to talk about where do we find hope? And I think it's just in places where things are hardest and in communities that are very localized. But yes, the phenomenon here is very, very strong, and we are, especially with nothing is rising anymore, or nothing is like shrinking. We already have shrunk spaces for civil society, and fascisms are here. It's not rising. The authoritarian regimes are not coming. They are here. So I think this is also very important to mention. The tense in which we are talking about what's happening to us at this very moment in time is very important. It's here. And from this point on, we really have to be very strategic. And I hope not very delusional as to what's going to happen to us, because the projections are not very hopeful. But I'm trying to find some joys, and I'm going to share where do I find them. I find a lot of joy in trans communities itself. And while we are talking about trans remembrance and murders against the community, we also have to celebrate trans joys and trans life. And I'm happy to share my own list in the chat of what brings me joy from the trans community these days. But yes, it's a difficult time, and we're going to be fine. This is not the first time we are having pushback for advancement for human rights. Exactly. That's the last thing I'm going to say for now, because I really can record a podcast or 7 of them about this, and I probably should at some point. But these are some of the chaotic thoughts where you're finding me right now. Hope this helps as an opening.
Thank you. Yes, it gives 2 different parts of the world, but the same different people with the same agenda, same politics, and affects all of us. And what you said, you started very negative, but then brought some hope. And I just remembered that 7 days ago we had within this series, the focus was on reviving reproductive justice, and one of our panelists, Ruth from Argentina, also who has lots of experience in protests, being on the street, etc., for reproductive rights of all people. At a certain point, she said, "But who said it's going to be easy?" So. And now I will come back to Susan, because Susan is full of these experiences, and I very often ask these questions. Susan already mentioned this historical timeline, or drawing the parallel, and why the movement, or from what people remember, Stonewall riots, but it was along with the civil rights movement, and there was anti-Vietnam War movements and Black movements, etc. And then later in the 70s, there was also the law on abortion, etc. So people were together. So you already somehow did that parallel. But now what interests me, because I think the story is very similar. What are the arguments that the Trump? Okay, we know that Trump is. I mean, I'm not going to give diagnosis, but just what things that he said are unacceptable on so many levels. But what was the narrative? Because there are other people, there are his proxies, who talk to people, and there are also other gay and trans and Black people and Muslim people who voted for Trump. And I always remember, and if I may, I will share this little story. Susan knows about the story. 10 years or so ago, when Susan was visiting Sarajevo, and I was working in one local NGO, and at the time in Bosnia, it was very hard to find a printing company who would print rainbow flags or trans flags, to have, because they just didn't want to do it due to moral or whatever reasons. And then finally, when we found a company and it was only 10 years ago, when we found a company who would print the trans flags, I was so happy. And then Susan is coming as a big professor and historian and speaker, and we visited several cities in Sarajevo, and I was so proud. And I was bringing that little flag with me, and I was putting it everywhere where Susan was, having lectures or speeches. And, I wanted to make it nice. And then Susan said, I don't care. And I was like, how come you don't care? And it's a trans flag. It was a big deal for me. And then there was one line that stuck in my head when Susan said, many good and bad things happen under flags. So now I go back to people that we think are allies that we end up to be on different sides. So we may be queer, but we don't, share the same position on certain war. We may be queer, but we think that climate change is not happening. Or, we may be together in climate change, but against each other. So why certain people are with the Republicans or with the right wing, if we want to put it in general, and what are these narratives that people bought? What are the narratives? Because in our personal talk, when we had the prep, you mentioned about conspiracy theories, which is very interesting because I did not know it was so obvious in the United States. I hear it here and there in the Southeast European region, but I would like you to share how far they go with their narratives.
Yeah, those are all very complex questions. Thank you though for bringing up the question about the flag. And for me, I feel ambivalence about flags because it's like I see it as an expression of a kind of nationalism, whether it's a cultural nationalism or an identitarian nationalism, but that it to me, like, a flag says this is my territory, like you're bounding a space that's like for people like you. And I just think it becomes a very slippery slope from like wanting to have space to like wanting to have an ethno-nationalist state, a place for people like me that others don't belong in. And so to me, it's just like I'm much more interested in sort of, open network relationships between people, without borders, without guards. That's the imaginary that I aspire to. And on the other hand, I think it can be very important to literally flag something, to signal something. It's like, here is a place for, we can create alliance around this. So, it's like there's pros and cons to flags, and to the ideas behind flags. How far has it gone in the United States with sort of conspiracy theories? I think I I think something new has happened in the United States. That although ideas about anti-gender ideology are quite well known for most people in the United States, that seemed like a quote unquote foreign way of thinking. It's like, oh, like they did that in the UK, or that was a Eastern European thing. Or it's like that it was known about, but that it wasn't necessarily the framework for analysis, or for organizing in the United States. But what we've seen over the last 2 years in particular, is that framework of all of the the bullet points you were talking about, it's like all of those bullet points are now being things that are explicitly written into laws in the United States as the same talking points. um, I really feel like we're witnessing the, again, quote unquote, end of American exceptionalism. It's not like the United States is doing something different than other parts of the world. It's like the same things that other parts of the world actually have much more direct experience with are also becoming exactly the same situation in the United States, and um, that's what the Trump victory has really helped solidify. Um, yeah, trying to put my thoughts in order here. Uh, I guess I just want to say that like we're still reeling over here in the U.S. right now. Like the common metaphor that I keep hearing is it's like we were waiting for biopsy reports. It's like we were waiting to get some news. And there was a lot of anxiety about like, well, is it going to be good news or it's going to be bad news? Because it could really be bad news. Kind of the emotional tone right now is like, okay, we got the biopsy results. It is cancer and it is advanced. I appreciated what you had to say about the tense in which we speak. It's not like, oh, bad things are coming. It's like it has arrived. The news has arrived. Like this is the reality of the situation here. And people are, you're taking stock of what this means, because I think it means something not just for the United States, but because of the role that the United States has played in the, post World War II global order. The fact that the United States has gone in an authoritarian oligarchic direction, fueled by populist resentment, just like that's something that changes the world order. And we're trying to figure out how to navigate in um, this new environment. Um, on the question of conspiracism, uh, I think that conspiracy theories are kind of the underbelly of democratic Republican politics. I mean, like in the sense of like a post Enlightenment, post French Revolution, post U.S. Revolution idea of a representative democracy based on Enlightenment ideas, which we all know have their ethnocentrisms and Eurocentrisms in them, but that still within that model of government where political authority derives from the consent of the governed, so to speak, where there are elections. Um, it's like that means that the people are the rather than like the king or God or whoever. It's like it's the people who are believed to have to be like the source of authority and sovereign power. And whenever you're like dealing with the people, I mean, you're dealing with people's emotions and feelings and perceptions. And so part of the art of governance in a democracy is to influence the feelings of people. I remember when Trump was on trial in the Stormy Daniels case, where he was, like given hush money to a porn star he'd hooked up with, um, that and that he was accused of violating campaign finance laws. That his lawyer says, yes, of course, Trump tried to influence the outcome of an election. That's called democracy. It's like so when you're dealing with those you know, manufacturing consents, among a mass of people for political gain, like to gain control of the state apparatus, um, conspiracies become really useful. Like they become stories that you can tell that like push people one direction or another. And it's just a routine part of the way that like um, public relations firms and political consultants work. It's like I remember when the Cambridge Analytica scandal came out of few years ago, like 8 years ago, 2016, 2017, where one of the the people caught on tape talking about how they'd, tried to manipulate public feeling around Brexit and around Trump's first election, just said, it's like elections run on two things, hope and fear. And, our job is to find what people are afraid of and to drop the bucket deeper into the well of that fear to like pull that up to the surface, as to raise the deepest fears we can as a way of influencing the outcomes of elections. And what's happened with trans issues, and why I think gender ideology and it has, or the accusation of gender ideology, that construct, has become so powerful, is that it's proven to be a place where many people have like deep unconscious and irrational fears about the other, or about themselves. Like when you confront the trans person, it's like you might recognize the possibility that you yourself could become undone somehow. There's a panic response to that. And so it's become a very useful uh, topic for linking the oppression of a tiny, relatively politically powerful minority of people to truly universal concerns and fears about one's personhood and subjectivity that become easily manipulated in the name of just speaking out for common sense. And so it's it's just telling wild stories about trans people, or I mean, things like Kamala Harris wants to give sex changes to undocumented immigrants in prisons who are here to take your job. I mean, it's like you're in somebody's bad dream. It's like you're in a, it's like the way all of these different elements get cobbled together into these fantastical narratives. It's just truly mind-boggling. It's like listening to conspiracy theories is like listening to somebody else's nightmare and realizing that you play a monster in their dreams. And that's being able to generate those narratives and those fears has just proven a very effective tool for people who are quite willing to cynically manipulate people's fears and feelings. And here we are.
Exactly, the manipulation. But I was just, thank you. I was shocked when you said, when we had the prep talk, because as I said, I hear it in the Balkan or Southeast European region here and there. We hear about, okay, gender ideology. I don't even know what that means. So I stopped discussing on those issues. But, depopulation agenda 2025, as we spoke about lizards and all these things, it really goes beyond everything. But now, so that's US. And, for the majority of the rest of the world, it's like, oh, US, they're always, different, they have these crazy ideas and stuff. But if we go back more east, my question to Nino would be, because before this, and you mentioned this, and this is very important, that not only anti-LGBTIQ plus law, but I call it informally like this for the sake of this conversation, but also the law on foreign agents that you mentioned, was also about to be passed a year ago, but there was also big, massive demonstrations, and it didn't pass. And now this year it did. So my question is, along these conspiracy theories, if I read well in this region, or also this region, which is inclining to be under Russian influence, what are the most prevalent myths or narratives that were spread there? Because some are based, that's what we also learned from the past session, some were based on ethno-nationalism, some play on this card of depopulation, if there are so many gays and trans people, the kids will not be born, and somebody else will take us over. Some play that card, some play on the card of the war. And we know that South Caucasus and the Balkan region as well is very prone to that. And as Susan said, it's playing the card of fear. It's just the question, what fear, So my question would be, so what are the most prevalent narratives that were spread and that people bought and that kept them in fear. Because when people are in fear, that's also something we talked about last time is, and especially when there's very bad socioeconomic situation, people tend to go for a strong hand, even though it's oppressive, but people think it will give them some stability. So I want to see what's the situation, if we go east in this part of the world. What was the messages that came from political leaders?
You're absolutely right. The war is one of the first ones I actually wanted to mention because the war in Ukraine was something Georgian government really manipulated with. Basically, the tone of it was, we don't want war, right? Because for the context, the last war was just like a decade and a half ago with Russian Federation, and in my own lifetime, the war in Ukraine is the third war I'm seeing between Russia and someone close, and so it's been really working. And what has been working exceptionally well is alignment of Georgian Orthodox Church with Russian Orthodox Church, who is a right hand of the Russian government. And so the rhetoric, the propaganda, and the messages which, by the way, are the most simple, most easily digestible, nothing very over-intellectualized. The way they are delivering these messages are extremely well absorbed and well digested by most common people. And I think this is exactly where we are losing, because I always say that far-right and anti-rights organizers, they do not disagree how to hate. They don't. They do not. They hate and that's it. While we always spend so much energy, time, and money to be very aligned, to be like, we do the work, right? To get each other on the same page. And by default, they had a shared vision of hating. So the hate and fear of the war and the hate towards LGBTQI people were two of the most important parts that were fueling Georgian government since forever, but especially in last 2 years, and that's why we are finding ourselves where we are. Not to go too far, and this perhaps is a little oversharing in some ways, but my own mother thinks that I'm talking to some children, that my work is talking to children. I don't know who they are, and I'm converting them into gays. And I wish I could, in all honesty. I wish that was my superpower. I probably would start from my own mother on that matter. But she thinks that Jesus Christ is protecting her from me turning her into a gay. This is an example that if we look where is she observing this is, first of all, church, and second of all, TV. And the way these messages are delivered to her are, again, very simple. While I am arguing with her through Judith Butler. So of course I'm losing this battle by default. And this unfortunately really worked with messes and the fear of gays are gonna take over Georgia and we're gonna have a gay parade, and queer community in Georgia is like, actually, we really want like basic human rights, like healthcare. We don't really go to the places of who we want to marry, right? So it's been working very well again, and the technology that was used. One thing is like, what are they sharing? What are the messages? Where does this come from, right? But the other thing is, what are the tools they use to deliver these messages, and the technology that they have used very well, while also silencing our side very, very strategically and actively. That has been a very important strategy. And I would say that Elon Musk's role in current US elections and the government that is coming together is extremely dangerous. And I'm not really sure how I don't even want to know. I don't want to think about this just yet. I guess I'm gonna cross that bridge when we get there in January, which is coming very, very fast. But the use of technology and the way they're silencing and shadow banning us is just really working. So yeah, that's what I would say. And of course, foreign agents law and the bill, when it was still a bill, it created a momentum and a lot of people protested because it was a bit more understandable as to why is that actually harmful for democracy in Georgia. But the same energy of protest and solidarity did not happen for the anti-gay propaganda bill. So unfortunately, this is the reality we are living in. Another one, the last one I would say for now, the narrative that government has been using for decades now is how civil society is like eating grants and is wasting money. I mean, they should look in the mirror perhaps, but ultimately what is happening is that they have been building up to this momentum, message by message, year by year. It did not happen overnight. It did not happen since 2023. It was very well calculated, very well funded as well. And of course, when rhetorics come from Russian Federation, unfortunately, but also does the money. So they have been abundantly resourced. So when you add up very simple messaging, platforms they use, tools they use, tactics they have, plus the resources they have, we by default are in very uneven positions.
Thank you for mentioning this new media, and which is all the information spread more fast, and disinformation and gatherings and information. And this was also one of the tools, if I remember correctly, during the Arab Spring uprising. It was at the time, before the X and Twitter. There's also interesting thing that it's a question to both of you whenever we get time. Just recently, one of the queer feminist organizations that I'm receiving the newsletter, and they wrote they will not be posting on X anymore because of Elon Musk and all that things. And to myself, and I also tend to be sometimes very, I wouldn't call it radical, but rather a principle, not supporting certain things. I just on contrary think that we should use those platforms, made by bad people for good intentions. So, but that's another set of the thinking. I will shortly go back to Susan again, just speaking of this. So we know they're here. We know when I'm talking them, I speak of right-wing anti-gender movements and all these conservatives and fascists. And we already know that gender sexuality is an easy playground. Just as that old poem says, first they came for communists. So I would say first they came for Jews and for gays, then they came for women, etc. If I remember correctly, and I would like, Susan, that you give us an answer, what would be a strategy today? So we remember, at least me in my LGBTIQ plus history when I was learning, and then you broaden up my horizons. We all know about Stonewall riots, right? And then you, as a historian, you made a movie on Compton's riots. Is Susan frozen? Yeah, could be, but I will anyhow continue with, yeah, Susan's back.
Right.
And so the Compton riots happened 3 years before the Stonewall, and it was transgender woman. And then also at that time, there were also gay liberation movements, sister abilities, etc. But when the Stonewall happened, that was when gays and lesbians and trans and everybody of different gender identities came together against oppression. So it was not differentiated anymore, if I understand history well. So my question is, how do we come together now? And this is the question that I always like to ask. You, as a professor, as a teacher and historian, do identity politics help us today or not, if we want to work as one? And what would be the new strategies comparing to 60s or 70s?
Again, really big questions.
Susan goes again. And I'm sure she will be back. Yeah, so also I want to
you're back. Okay. Okay, so
Perfect.
I think I'm back now. I'm sorry, my internet seems to be unstable this morning. Uh, can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
All good. Um, okay, let me uh, actually, if you wanted to like continue on for just a second, I'm gonna maybe switch over to my phone rather than my laptop because the connection is sometimes better on that. Can you give
Yeah,
me
of course.
1 second? All right.
In
So,
the meantime, I will just tell people that they can post questions in the chat and that we will have a time. And I already have gathered some thanks to my team because I don't have time always to look in the chat. So there are questions for Susan and Nino. And yes, these are very broad topics, but it would be a pity not to use such a resourceful Susan and Nino with us, not to discuss it broadly. So how do we come together again? As a queer community, I'm not even talking about the other allies. How do we, gay, lesbians, trans, and other identities come together and then join also other movements, which are now ongoing. There's also this debate, is there one feminism or if there are more feminisms? And yes, there is ecofeminism and transfeminism, but for me, the core should be always the same. Against oppression, against injustice, etc. So, see, US is not that great at all. I mean, San Francisco, the internet is going up and down. Just the mic, please.
okay, I'm back. I blame Elon Musk. Yeah, let me. All right, am I still in the Zoom?
We hear
Yes, you would
you.
just need to start a video so that I
Okay, all right.
can
So,
add you then. Thank you.
all right, back.
Okay.
All right, where were we? What was the question?
How do we come together, like in the
Oh,
Stonewall times?
yeah. I think identity politics are a two-edged sword because on the one hand, we all live in the world in a particular way. We're categorized a certain way socially. You're a man, you're a woman, you're gay, you're straight, you have this racial or ethnic identity, you're from this language user community. So I do think it's important to think about the specific ways that we as individuals are part of groups that are part of nations. That's really important, and yet there can be a way that divides rather than unites. And so this is where I feel like for me the idea of trans is really important, not just in the terms of transgender identity, but like trans in the sense of you're moving across something. Like what is the actual logical operation that happens when you think about trans? It's like if you're moving across something, well, that means there's some kind of division, that you're moving across. And so what does that trans move do? Sometimes it means this or that, sometimes it means this and that. Sometimes it means neither this nor that, or sometimes it means both this and that. There's many different ways to quote unquote trans something. And so I think about identity politics that way. Sometimes it's important to talk about a specificity of something, and sometimes it's important to talk about something more general. How are you part of something bigger than your specificity? And that takes I think lived experience of like knowing how to move back and forth across those things. I also think it takes work to build alliances across differences. And, that to me is one of the most vital tasks for us in civil society right now, of like finding the points of connection and affinity across differences, in the name of a common cause. That we, I think about the feminist theorist Sarah Ahmed, who writes about what she calls an affinity of hammers. Like if you're being hammered by the same thing, perhaps you have a common cause in resisting that particular way of getting hammered by the world. So yeah, I not to get too academic, but I do think about Michel Foucault's work here and the way power circulates. And he says, power divides things, and that the way power circulates, like it always finds finer and finer grained ways of separating a population, and so that it becomes capillary, like your veins. It's like it's like power wants to become increasingly capillary in how it circulates through you. And that it's like whatever move you make to get outside power just uses that to create another way of capturing you. And so I think identity works that way. It's like in the name of moving towards a certain kind of freedom or power based on what your own historical experience has been as a woman, as a queer person, as a trans person, as a racial minority. That when you make that move to assert power that way, power just finds a different way to circulate through that. It captures it. And so that's the thing that I don't think we've quite figured out how to do as a movement, of like, how do you resist that entire framework of how power tries to capture you and circulate through you. How do you refuse that? Or if you can't refuse it, how do you move within it in a different way? And that to me is like the deep politics of transness. It's like it's finding a way of moving within a certain structuration of power towards an outside or towards new potentials within it that have yet to be realized or actualized. That there's something very experimental and exploratory about it. It's like it's searching for exit paths. And we haven't found it yet. We're still looking, but I'm committed to the project of like thinking and being trans as a way of moving towards freedom and community with others in an experimental way.
Thank you. And it must be hard, especially living the identity and the stories. But as you said, we haven't figured it out, but we can learn it only by doing. I mean, it's.
And I will say, that I think I have a slightly different understanding of the way identity politics worked in the US in the later 60s and early 70s. Speaking from a trans perspective, it's like what I saw happening, like, I was a little kid when it was happening, but what I know from studying is that very quickly, it's like it was around 1973, when the sort of neoliberal moment hits, that very quickly something that had been, I think, a more diverse kind of revolutionary, chaotic, utopian movement in the later 60s and early 70s, that people doubled down on identity categories. It became a gay and lesbian movement that trans people were excluded from, and that in the name of a certain kind of cis gay and lesbian and feminist movement towards a kind of mainstreaming and access to social normativity, that trans people were completely thrown thrown out of that, that we were rendered an inconsequential minority rather than like a part of a broader social movement. And so, I definitely see the downside of identity politics, particularly when you start to play games about who's more oppressed. It's kind of like, oh, like you're complaining about things that are happening to trans people, but like look at what's happening to women in Afghanistan under the Taliban. It's kind of like, yes, that is really bad, and it doesn't trump the idea of like trans people in the West are also experiencing oppression, and what you need to do is develop an analysis and a politics that is capable of addressing both of those things, rather than creating a hierarchy about whose oppression is worse and whose needs count for more.
Exactly. Thank you so much for such a broad and touching upon that, which often happens also in activist and feminist circles. Now going back to Nino, and how do people of Georgia or people of South Caucasus, but also including people from Central Asia, which is one very interesting region because it's very hard to get information from there. And what I found interesting, this is something I really did not know, that activists from surrounding countries used to flee to Georgia, like people from Belarus, Azerbaijan, Kyrgyzstan, etc. So they were fleeing to Georgia because it was not a safe haven, but it was the situation was better, and Georgia's known for their protests. And then, so there's that part of identity of queerness, let's say, and then the Russian-Ukraine war starts, and there is again polarization within feminist movements, just like for the Israel-Palestine, etc. So my question is, how do you see, who are your allies? Where do you look allies from, especially now having in mind that Trump won, and with the funding cuts and with the possible backlash also. So where do you find strength and where do you find allies?
First of all, I really appreciate bringing in the regional dimension to what seems like a one country problem, because you're very right. And we spoke about this when we had the chance of being in person, but because of the different authoritarian regimes that Georgia as a country is surrounded by, North Caucasus as well, like for example, Chechnya is our border, well, Turkey as well, and Azerbaijan. And then there are wars and there are dictatorships of Lukashenko's, for example. Yes, it was a safer place for activists to live, especially given the fact that we did not, well, Georgia does not require visas. Like you can stay there for a year without visa, leave one day, come back and like continue your life. So that was a very comfortable place, but we already are observing the Georgian government actually not letting in activists and political dissidents in the country since last couple of months especially. And obviously it's becoming more and more evident, not that we didn't know about this, but there's evidence of them really closely aligning with KGB. So this is very, very devastating and very dangerous. So for the human rights defenders that Georgia was a safer place and or permanent or temporary place of residence, it's cut. Where do people go next? I do not have answer for just yet. I would say perhaps trying Moldova is an option because they recently had election and thank God they have result they wanted. But of course, like how many times can you relocate, right? I mentioned Kyrgyzstan adopted the law in April, sorry, and then in May, Georgia had the same law, and there were activists who came from Kyrgyzstan to live in Georgia, and we met them with our own foreign agents law, and they are now in a position of figuring out what's next for them. And this is just one example, right? So where is safer, especially given the results of different elections in global north? I don't know, for global majority, not only just for Georgia, it's a very big question. I would say that nowhere is safe at this point, especially The Trump election will give us a big punch, not a pinch, unfortunately, wherever each of us live. And so the solution I am trying to find for myself and like trying to figure out how to navigate this is perhaps more localized communities. Offline and more localized communities are the infrastructures of care and mutual trust that we can lean on. I would say that when the full-scale invasion started in Ukraine, one thing we saw from day one was that people who were most prepared were queer people and sex workers. And there are multiple reasons for this, right? But biggest one is that life for these communities have always been difficult. What's peace, after all? And the biggest safety we had was safety of each other. So I would say that this is exactly, I work in philanthropy and funders are always keen to find the innovation and the groundbreaking solution for life. And I guess my answer at this point is very pragmatic. We have to go back to basics. Basics of being in community with each other. And I see many of you with like family names from Balkans, and I guess for many of us who have experienced war, we know that in times of really big hardship, we have each other and that's it. So, and as a war child myself, I don't like what my body is doing right now because I feel the feelings that are unfortunately very, very familiar, but this is what we have to do at this moment. So investing in our physical offline communities. I'm not saying we shouldn't organize globally, by no means. I think the connections there are insanely important, but we are in times where global solidarity, especially of those in power, so that they can influence governments like mine, is not going to happen because these governments are having far right or fascist governments. They're fascist. They're far right. Period. And of course, they're just clapping their hands like Orban claps for my government currently, and they're happy that Georgia is going down to drains. So, and then in terms of like solidarity, I always have big questions, existential questions. I guess, what does it mean in practicality? And I would say that what people are trying to organize for Palestine has very tangible results. And I feel that's a way of like actually seeing a hope and seeing result in the resistance. So desperate times, I guess, and desperate measures is where we are currently. So communities is, I guess, my biggest hope and something I will be very heavily leaning on as 2025 arrives. We still have 2 months, I guess, to just enjoy whatever peace we have left, and then we'll see. But again, as difficult as it will be, we will figure this out as much as we figured out many other things in our lives, and this is not the first crisis any of us will be moving through. Look at me trying to be like, oh no, we are not doomed. We are doomed, but also not really, because I don't know. I am fantasizing about not only like communities, but also like physical spaces where these communities will organize, and having a feminist bunker. Not that I want to leave when things really fall apart, but I just want to be with people I really love being around if we have to get there. So if anyone is interested in building a feminist bunker with me, there are some people actually thinking about it. It will have leopard prints on walls.
Well, you will have somebody from across the sea from US. Before I go to Susan, and I want to stay on this, and we also want to, I have some questions that I have received from the chat that I want to also leave time for you to reflect on that. But speaking of all this, and I see, Nino, how you're trying to pull out, and I feel we're tired in general, and feminists and queer, and generally oppressed people, because it's constant struggle. But as Susan said last time when we spoke as a prep, I've been there. I know that for some of us, it's maybe, I think we're 3 generations here now talking. But my question to Nino before I go to Susan is, how do you stay resilient? You just gave some positive notes of the community, but how do you yourself stay resilient? What can we do for ourselves? Because if I'm not good, I won't be able to contribute and to do anything. Any tips or anything?
I am really the worst person who can give tips about how to take care of herself. But I would say have dogs. Dogs help. And that's like my ultimate solution for life problems right now. But when I say communities, I'm not just preaching it, I truly mean it. And actually, the reason why we very luckily accidentally met in Sarajevo was one of the communities that I'm part of that came together. And this community specifically is working on digital rights. And this is a community of artists and activists, researchers, funders who understand that we are all in this together. And this was a space where people did not have oppression Olympics, like Susan was mentioned, who is more oppressed and who has more. People were from Gaza, from Togo, from Bosnia as well, that came together and brought pieces of what they have to offer. And I think, like, for me, that is generosity of this very moment, of people understanding that we are not against, we shouldn't be at least against each other. We really are fighting against something that is like it's really killing us, actually. It's not like, we are talking about physical survival in so many ways as well. So yeah, going back to people, and there was a question also about how do we navigate trans exclusionary feminists or anti-sex worker feminists, and how our language is in like what's the word? What's the English word for it? Co-opted, I guess, and also how they're infiltrating our spaces, how much they have learned from us. And like inner child in me, who is usually very like, how can I break things and how can this make biggest trouble for everyone, is asking, how can I actually learn from far right? What can I learn from tactics, because they have been learning from us, and how can we use some of their own tools against them? So that's, I guess, the imagination is another piece, like political imagination of what could be, is another thing I'm always very entertained by, and I find a lot of hope in. So
I
yeah.
like that tip about reverse strategies. So we learn from them because they also started using our narratives, when it comes to pro-life, like it's like no abortion, but nobody will talk about domestic violence, killed women or killed trans people, or queer people. So then we don't talk about pro-life. We have very few minutes left. I want to, Susan, if I may, correct me if I'm wrong. I took it from your transgender history. There is a quote which says, and then I will ask you the final question, and then we go to questions from the audience. The quote says, when people struggling against injustice have no hope that anything will ever change, they use their strength to survive. When they think that their actions matter, that same strength becomes a force for positive change. So we have to find it within us, and then we're in how we use it. But there is another question, actually. You can also, Susan, refer to this. And of the description of the movie or the documentary film that I recommend everybody to look at to learn a piece of history that I personally did not know of, the Screaming Queens, the Riot from the Diphtheria. One of the descriptions says that this documentary tells the forgotten story of the first collective act of militant resistance to the social oppression of queer people in the United States. My question is, speaking of resistance, because we're also resisting as feminists, as queers, as activists, as living beings, fighting for social justice after all. Is there a peaceful resistance is that a possible one? Do you, when I think of Stonewall, or when I think of the first, second wave of feminists, I think of the authentic people who went with their bodies, to against the system. Now we have all the modern tools. We have the online social media. We know a lot. We have theories developed. As Nina said, we have the playbook of the anti-gender actors. But is it still peaceful resistance possible, or do we have to be more allowed, or take the streets again, reclaim the space?
Oh, I would say that survival is a form of resistance. And that, I agree, with what was saying about increasingly opportunities for public existence for many kinds of marginalized communities. Those spaces are being shut down, and that what we have are our interpersonal networks, our pods, our feminist bunkers, our mutual aid groups that, we have each other and we have to take care of each other. And to me, like, that sense of collective care, is that's our strength, and we can do that. We can practice that to the best of our ability. I think we can find inspiration by learning what people are doing in other locations. I mean, I just had a chance to be in Athens a few weeks ago, and there was a group there called the Feminist Autonomous Collective for Research. They were doing some amazing work. They were like both academics and former academics and academics in exiles and community-based researchers who were doing feminist work in an autonomous way, where they were like working on, migration and, asylum issues, where they were teaching courses on like trans feminism and lesbian history. They were building intentional community outside of Athens and the islands. They were, they were engaged in climate justice. They were engaged in anti-gender research. It's like, oh, like here's a model, I thought, for how people can do work that they care about in a moment of crisis. And so to network around, to find ways of being inspired by what others are doing elsewhere and learning from it, I think is really important as we learn, deeper and deeper ways to take care of ourselves. Is, the question about militancy or, is, and about commitments to like peaceful nonviolent change. I think if we look trans historically, at least in recent decades, like, or maybe back into the 19th century, it seems that the social movements that use nonviolent tactics have had greater success, and that the more militant it becomes, the more it becomes armed struggle, the more often it results in non-democratic outcomes, even, and so, I always think there's a place for pushing back against the violence that's directed at you, to not acquiesce to violence directed at you, and to resist that, or to take that energy that's directed at you and, push it in another direction. I just want to mention this film that you've mentioned, Screaming Queens, the Riot at Compton's Cafeteria. It was about a militant act on the part of trans women who were mostly sex workers, who lived in a very poor neighborhood in central San Francisco, who were resisting routine state-sanctioned violence against their lives. And that there was a particular late-night restaurant that people would go and, get off the street and have, cheap food and see their friends and whatnot. And the police would raid that constantly. And one night, for a variety of reasons, the queens, as they called themselves, just had enough, and they fought back. And you know, it's like and that's what I made the film about. For those of you who have better Russian language skills than English language skills, it's like that film is streaming at the LGBT online Russian film festival. They call themselves a film festival in exile, and they stream media content for a couple of weeks at a time. And I gave that film to the festival. They have Russian subtitles on it. I just did a panel with people yesterday in Moldova and in Siberia, and people who were using VPN networks to hide their geographical location from inside Russia. So anyway, I feel very happy that this film about militant resistance to trans oppression is available there right now. And I just was talking with the festival director earlier this morning, asking if they could leave it up, you know, for a while longer. So I said yes, of course. So it's there. The thing that, you know, the thing that I found so inspiring about the action of those women back in 1966 is that, you know, they didn't have a set of demands, you know, policy demands, or, you know, here's what we want, or this is what freedom looks like. It's just like, you know, they were asserting this really fundamental ability to just exist in public, you know, that there was an assertion of a capacity to just be, you know, that society was trying to shut that down, erase their lives, confine it, wipe it out, brutalize it. And it was just a no, you know, you just say no and you push back. And, you know, looking at that incident as a historian, I know that for a couple of years afterwards, there were some changes in policy within the city of San Francisco about how trans people were treated. You know, there were some changes in police practices. There were greater access to some healthcare services. But within a few years, it had kind of like gone back to the way that it was before. But still, it's like those people took an action. They did something, and it left a mark in the historical record that people could find later. You know, I found it later, you know, and I've told their story. And like, for me, that's been one of the highlights of my career as a historian, is being able to share that story of resistance and pass it along from the past to the future because of the work that I do in the present. That feels like very meaningful work to me. And I think we have to think like that in the present, you know, that, you know, what we do now, it might seem like it's bleak or it's hopeless, or, you know, the world has, you know, shut us down, but that when it matters, when we take a stand, when we express our freedom and power and assert our life, our joy, I don't even want to call it a right to be, our capacity to be, when we assert our actual existence, that will leave a mark somewhere. It's like, and people in the future will find it. So, you know, to realize that we're not just living for ourselves now, but we're living for a future that we believe is possible, and acting with that in mind. That is a really important thing for us to do right now.
That was a beautiful, it was really beautiful closing, sort of. It just made me think, and I know once you also said, when you talk, you always say, oh, I've been through that, you know, at least I will write it and it will stay, like some others have left it written that we read today or not with us anymore. I will just quickly, it's almost time, but I just want to reflect on 3 questions that my dear colleague brought to me from the chat. I'm sure you saw it. One, I think we covered already. If our task is to find what unites us, what about trans exclusive actors from the feminist movements? and divisions when it comes to positioning on Gaza and Israel politics. I think we have covered that part, and also there are great organizations in Israel. Women in Black is one of the oldest one who had very strong feminist and lesbian and social justice, human rights, peace activism. And the other one, just shortly, it's a very relevant and new one, and I also feel like old school sometimes, from Carolyn. Do you observe a potential shift in focus among anti-gender actors from targeting sexual and reproductive rights, sexual and health education, gender equality, to influencing digital rights and policy? Do you think those of us resisting the anti-gender agenda have perhaps underestimated or missed this shift in focus? Nina, you are very much involved in these digital things. As I said, I'm very old school, so maybe just a few words on that, and Susan also.
Yeah, yes is the short answer. We absolutely did overlook this, and I would say that my dog wants to talk to you. I would say that, as it always happens, we are against big tech, the logic of corporations, capitalism, and life has been very difficult because of technology for quite some time, and I think it's gonna get only weirder. And we still yet to have we will see what's full capacity of what that will mean and look like, unfortunately, under Elon Musk's powers in next couple of years. And I think practically speaking, technology can also serve us at least at this moment in time before we become fully closed. And I think perhaps last note of where I would want to end the conversation today on my end is we have to be very proactive and strategic about what's coming. And we know that what's coming is mass surveillance and the use of data and technology in whole new ways, shapes, and forms. Therefore, what Susan mentioned about VPNs is one very practical solution that we have to do now. And Georgia was a very good example of that, because we still can use internet. And there are countries where the freedom of access to internet is not happening currently. So while we have it, there are so many different ways, shapes, and forms in which we can be prepared. So I guess we should not only talk about the response to the crisis that is coming, but also preparedness for this crisis. And unfortunately, the digital part and technology will be very important part of how we will be attacked. Therefore, how can we defend ourselves? When I say let's get offline, I also mean like offline from technology. And unfortunately, in last year, we have seen how tech has been used in so many new inventive ways, like, for example, pagers being bombs now. So yeah, this is very scary, and also there is a lot of opportunity. So I wanna hope that we will be smart about using it there are amazing feminist techies in this world, and they are my hope. And for example, Nolan Fund is living, breathing example of that, because they're supporting feminist technology and creation of feminist technology that we desperately need right now. So no, we are not done actually. We're gonna be just, and this is gonna be yet another something we will move through and we will resist. So I have to mute myself because my dog really wants to talk to you, but thank you so much for the opportunity to come together, because this is also a space where we can feel that this is not a single issue happening in single country to a single person, right? These connections and these narratives and stories coming together ultimately will help us to figure out what resistance will look like in practicality. And this is actually a practical way of resisting as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Nina, for closing with that. And also, as Susan said, the way of resistance, I mean, having film festival in exile, Russia, VPN and all that stuff, that's what we use. We live it and we use it already. Any last wording from San Francisco before it's 8:39?
Not really. I mean, other than just say it's felt really significant to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to say some words and learn from others. I hope, I know, Naida, we're already in touch, but I hope we, can stay in touch as well. I think I'll be in Barcelona this summer, so but yeah, just on that tech question, it's so pervasive. It's like we live inside it now. I think, will be increasingly used against us. We need to keep moving. Like, I have recently built up my social media presence on Blue Sky rather than because X has just become so completely toxic and targeting of trans people. But I think we can't forget the old school paper-based, face-to-face ways of organizing, that we need to have phone trees, that are not, not on you're not just like reaching out to people on the internet or through your social media, that like you've got somebody's phone number or where they live and you go knock on their door. I think we have to do geographically based organizing in our own neighborhoods and communities. We have to do verbal communication, not necessarily something that's going to be surveilled, by the platform we're communicating on. So yeah, encrypt your messages, that just be very strategic about what you're choosing to make public or how you're choosing to communicate on corporate controlled platforms, and build those really grassroots, face-to-face, person-to-person, locally based networks for mutual aid and for survival. I mean, that really is the moment that we are in.
Thank you both so very much from the bottom of my heart. Nino, for you to jumping in, and I know you travel a lot, you do lots of philanthropic work. You can find Nino under Dalan Fund and get in touch. And Susan, big thanks to you, as if I may call you a friend. I really had the privilege to meet you, and hope, I mean, I'm not maybe going to Barcelona, but we meet somewhere in between. I also want to thank everybody who joined us and stayed for an hour and a half. I know you're coming from different parts of the world, and just, I don't want to close in a sad tone, but just as something that would give us fuel for further, is I remind us again, today is 20th of November. It's a Trans Day of Remembrance. And let's just have some time with ourselves to reflect of 350 murdered people who are transgender or gender variant or non-binary, but also all the other, our friends and colleagues and comrades, feminists and queers, and everybody else in the world who's suffering right now. And that's our job to fight for justice for everyone. And thank you from the bottom of my heart. Stay strong and resilient and keep in touch. See you in 2 weeks' time for a new event. Bye-bye.
Bye.